Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you, everyone. It's another beautiful Sunday afternoon, but that also depends on your point of view, doesn't it? And the important thing to understand is that we're all here for a purpose. We may not know the purpose, but you're not here for no purpose. That's what you do know. So each of us is on our own journey. This is the KAKT Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We're rolling along in the advanced transition stage, and we're going to talk about state dependency. My name is Alexander. I'm from Canada. It is August the 11th, 2024. This is the KAKT Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So thank you all for going through this. As you've seen, it's an extension of a series of advanced teachings. Please understand the purpose of this is to distill the thousands of hours of teaching into smaller bite-sized forms. This is to accommodate the new knowledge seekers who are being attracted to the foundation very rapidly, and it's also to assist the mature knowledge seekers to be able to explain in their own way, and we hope this helps. But please remember, as advanced as these may seem to be, they're really very basic. And so we are trying to understand why we're stuck on this hesitancy highway. And of course, it's the lowest energy state, and that's why. And it is very enjoyable. Well, that's the intention. Many of us find that life is very hard. And so they say it's hard until you get up on the horse. And we choose a horse because bulls walk, but horses, however, might even fly. And isn't that what we want to do? Because we want to search for outer space. Maybe we want to be galloping across the universe on that plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. We always seem to settle for so little. In the books of Narantavakoli Kesh, book number 1 talks about the universal order of creation of matter. How many of us are going through life with no clue? And then we talk about, in book number 2, the structure of the light. Many of us have no clue. And the clue that we may have was taught incorrectly. Which leads us to book number 3, the origin of the universe. Well, isn't that a subject that is so far away? But if we go far away, you can't say that you're from Washington or from Paris. Who knows where that is? You have to say that you're from Earth. Oh, I think we know where Earth is. Somewhere in the solar system. And so that's why it's important. And that's why for 338 weeks, Rick Crammond and the Universal Council have been bringing together every Tuesday the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. And does this race make us all racists? This is the interesting question. And so to help us navigate through this, we were given commandments. We were also given a new set of commandments. And it really fills in the picture, doesn't it? And so this is food for thought. And food for thought is really important if we're going to get on the plasma highway, because the food that we know is the food that we consume, and that's part of the transmission highway. How do we get from the transmission highway to the plasma highway? Well, there is a transition highway in between, and that's what we're talking about. And if we're in between, well, how do we know which way we're going from there? Is it automatic that if we go up, that we keep going up, or if we go down, we keep going down? Or can we go up and down? Well, when we look at our goals and aspirations, some of us, the only aspirations we have is to have ambition, because we just want that little piece of pie in the MAGRAPH pie chart. And we want some stability. So we see that the speed of light is very stable and has a constant transmission. But then if it's constant, how does it have variable transition? And if the universe is 99% hydrogen, what is the rest? Is it garbage? Is that where we're going? Or are we here? Or are we here? Well, wherever that is. And these are the questions that many of us are afraid to ask, because who are you going to ask? Who is it that's knowledgeable in this? So when we look at the basic science and we had to understand new terminology, sure, we understand the three dimensions of the X, Y, and Z axis, but when we reference one, its transmission involves rotation. The other one is transition, involves polarity. The other one is transmutation, that involves field strength. Well, that's great. And which state are we talking about? And how do we go from state to state? So we have to introduce transition dimensions. Well, wait a second. The x-axis is focused on transmission. Well, which x-axis? So the x-axis goes through transitions. And of course, this is the domain of the y-axis, but transition from which transmission state to which transmission state? And along this transition dimension, then there has to be a transmission, doesn't it? And so the combination of the x-axis and the y-axis fulfills the third dimension of the z-axis. And it too is a transition dimension, because, of course, it depends on the x and y-axis, doesn't it? And since they all depend on the transmission, so does the z-axis. Well, there we go. Now we understand that there's more to understand. So when we say that two forces come together, we are not very specific. We're just saying two forces, any two forces coming together. And where are they? Well, one of the things we say is that they form a combination of the x-axis dimension and the y-axis dimension. And where does that energy come from? And what is that energy? So that energy comes from the universe. And that energy is part of the universe because the universe exists from energy. So that energy is always positive. So the direction of the energy is the charge in motion. And so if the direction of the energy is reflected in the charge in motion, then there is a to and a from. And so that means that all things are working in combination. And so we see that the structure of the light is a connection between two fields. But which state? Which energy state? And can we transcend energy states? Well, we must take into account how we get our energy and what is energy. And so from a physiological standpoint, we see that sugar energy is the energy that we're looking for. But sugar comes in various states. So we see the hexagonal gravitational manifestation of sugar energy. And through a twisting susceptibility from a pentagonal magnetical sugar energy state and the back and forth twisting and twisting and twisting and twisting, we give and take, give and take, and give and take, and we continue to give and take, and we create this coiling. So that's part of the pattern template that we have, and it facilitates a spherical growth. And when we look at the water molecule, which is a combination of the hydrogen and the oxygen, that is a parcel. And each of the components is an energy pack that's packed within this parcel. And we find that the hydrogen is magnetical, the oxygen is gravitational, but the combination is a maggrav. A maggrav is, of course, a balance. And the water molecule is round. Well, if it's in balance, it doesn't look very balanced when you look at the hydrogen and the oxygen. You've got two tiny hydrogens and one big fat oxygen, and you call that balance? That doesn't look very balanced. But interestingly, even when we give off one hydrogen, we leave a hydroxyl behind. Well, so now we have a hydrogen in motion that's positive and a hydroxyl also in motion, but it's negative. Negative because, of course, it's lost. It's lost that balancing hydrogen, right? But it's still a maggrav. It's still in balance, so it's balance seeking. And in that process, there's a crossover. And there's a lot of deflection and twisting, which involves tightening, coiling, and tunneling. And these are all energy packs in motion. And energy is always in motion. And so this stands in stark contrast to the electron fixation fallacy as put forward by Richard Feynman, who was a very fine scientist, but he was stuck with the electron fixation. And of course, that led to Professor Nambu and was discussing how the moving of electrons is applied to the future and the past by saying there's no creation nor annihilation, but only a change of directions of moving particles. And the movement is from the future to the past or from the past to the future. Where exactly is that? I need to get that map. And then we have to figure out how do we change our position on that map, because that position is part of the field capture. And so as we're discussing transition, when we see there's an x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis transition, but it's not just perpendicular to the ground or elevated above the ground, but we have to ask ourselves which ground. And then once we're on that ground, how do we move? And if there's more than one ground, well, how do we move from ground to ground? Because, the only understanding that we have is the x-axis dimension on the ground. But if we look at our planet, we find that it has a rotating field. We call it the z-axis. And then it has a y-axis dimension, which is defined by polarity. And so the z-axis dimension is defined by interdependence. Interdependence of what? Well, interdependence of the current state of the x-axis interacting with the current state of the y-axis. Well, what state is that? Well, that's a good question. Does anyone have an answer? So when we look at the graph of the pH table, which stands for the potentiation of hydrogen, and this is reflected in the water. So we say on the high end it's alkaline and the low end is acidic, but in the center it is neutral. But there are various weigh stations in between. And so how do we get to these weigh stations? And so we just say, well, it's dependent on susceptibility. But what determines the susceptibility and how do we define that? So what are the repercussions of this susceptibility? So when we look at the potentiation of hydrogen, we have to understand that the water splitting is always totaling 14. That's why the pH table is up to 14. So when we look at the neutral and say that it's 7, it means that the pH of 7 could be acidic and it could be alkaline. So the total of the pH of 7 acidic and the total of the pH of 7 of alkaline is 14. But if we see that as a zipper and we find that, wait a second, it has to always be 14. Yeah, because as you go through different potentiation layers, if you create one on the acidic side, you have to balance it off with something on the alkaline side. Otherwise, well, it just wouldn't be balanced. So 6 plus 8 is 14, 4 and 10 is 14, etc., etc. And as we go along this transmission line on the pH table, and so we can, open or close the zipper, right, by traveling along the x-axis dimension. Okay, well, that's fine, but we travel along the ground and the zipper travels on the y-axis transition. So when we're looking at the pH transition, we see that there are peaks and valleys. So even in these peaks and valleys, we see this y-axis transition obeying the same pH transition rule. So, but, where you have the peak of the 4 is offset by the peak of the 10, 10 and 4 is 14. So what is affecting, of course, is density. And the reason it is important is because pH stands for potentiation of hydrogen, but also it stands for the potentiation of oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen are two of the constituents of water. So we find that if water is acidic, it's oily, and if water is alkaline, it's wet. And I said, well, water is just water, and water is always wet. There is a difference in the water because it's affected by density, and gravity seeks density. So the more dense it is, the more alkaline it is. And so therefore, the spread between the force field of the oxygen and the force field of the hydrogen is also spread. But the balance always totals 14. So if we look at the pH transition and we say, well, it's composed of peaks and valleys. So if the density is gravitational, then the peak is magnetical. So we could see the same thing with mountains. But what happens in a valley? Well, then the bottom of the valley is magnetical, and then deeper down is gravitational, because that relationship has to be constant. But that would be on one particular pH, any pH. But if we look at the relationship between the pH balancing and we see the pH transition, in the alkaline state being gravitational, in the acidic state being magnetical, we find that a peak at 6 has to be offset with a peak at 8, and a valley at 5 has to be offset with a valley at 9. So how do we go from these peaks to these valleys, and how do we go back up again? So if we started with the cups of life and we saw that we had physical components in the cups of life, and we added water and we added some salt solution, and we nano coated some copper and a few other things, and so we created 2 cups, and these cups represented an inner space strength. One was emotional and one was physical. And this was very important. And for many of us, we are always talking about the big C. And of course, the big C for many of us is cancer. But in life, the big C is carbon. And so with the carbon, we're able to create a whole bunch of things in the cups of life. Obviously, carbon dioxide GANs and calcium and zinc and copper GANs, water GANs and amino acid GANs, and even gold GANs, just to name a few. But fundamentally, the important reason for the cups of life, they weren't for the cups of the pandemic. They were to facilitate the emotional and physical vitality. And each of us was capable of doing this for pocket change. And we were capable of doing that in our homes. And so we had this atomic physicality of components. We had the nanocoating components, and we created the GANs components. But all of these were part of the Z-axis transition dimension in physicality. And because there were different GANSs that we created, this all became part of the transmission susceptibility. And even some of the GANSs we found, and when they displayed a color, they would change that color. Well, change of the color indicated a change in pH, didn't it? So how do we bridge these gaps? So we have to understand that the principal matter interaction comes from energy in motion. And when that energy arrives, there has to be a common denominator. And since we are complex, we find that we have different energy states within us. But it's not just us. It's a fundamental construct of the atomic structure, where there are different energy levels within. And it is because of these different energy levels that are within, we can determine what these products are. So we have to understand that, well, yes, we have a sun, and yes, we have an earth, and argue how you like, but they were here before we were born. And so the real question then becomes not just how we were born, but how were they created? Well, they were created by the same fundamental rules of the principal interaction of energy and motion on a two-way street. And so we've seen there's a two-way transition and a two-way transmission. And in that way, not only is there an interaction between the sun and the earth, but we have to understand that from Earth's point of view, it has to interact with itself, because the earth is, generally speaking, we call it the blue planet because we're the water planet. But not only, we have a whole bunch of things on this planet. And so they too were created, and they too were created before we arrived. So to understand the basic science, you have to understand the negative charge principle, where the negative gives and the positive takes. And so when you look at that relationship, when you give and take from yourself, well, that energy is binding, but the energy can also be flowing. So that means you have to give to others and take from others. And this is where we run into some problems. We have to understand that there are feeding dimensions and feedback dimensions. And we have to understand that one feeding dimension is not the same as another feeding dimension. It is just one dimension. And so when you have one dimension plus another one dimension, you get more than two. And the reason for that is because you still have the one dimension. You don't sacrifice the first dimension to get the third dimension. And you don't sacrifice the second dimension to get the third dimension. And you don't get to do that either because you're just an observer. And through our observations, sometimes we fudge things. So we're none of these dimensions. We're in a fourth dimension because we're part of the gravitational conformation. Because on this planet, everything was created from hydrogen. And we see the signature of the hydrogen. It manifests itself in light. And it's a unique form of light. And it includes all of the layers, all of the different field strengths. And these field strengths have attracted certain energies from the universe. And so they're unique to this particular field, which we call hydrogen. And so by being able to see visibly with our physical eyes, we can see the colors, we can determine that it's hydrogen, it's unique. But that hydrogen came as a gravitational manifestation from the interaction of the magnetical force fields of the sun and the earth. But not only, also from the universe. We are just the observer. And observe this. Here's a frozen gas ball. And you see the gravitational core and the magnetical hair-like lines. And in order to see these lines through the ice, you have to recognize that these lines are hollow. And of course, being gas balls, they created nanotubes. And so these nanotubes are also hollow. Nature's a wonderful artist, isn't it? So this artistic creation was created through this folding deviation, and it's fundamental because it's part of the amino acid star formation. So beyond the hydrogen, the solar system created also other components, and we see oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen being part of that. And if you add these components to the human body, well, you find it's all the same. And so it only stands to reason that if we're part of the human body in the body of the solar system, that there should be a common denominator there. And of course, other elements that we see in our earth are also within our body. Most notably is calcium. And we see the calcium in our bone structure. We see it in our cartilage, but we don't see it in our blood. And in fact, when we talk about the big C, we're referencing carbon. And carbon is fundamental because not only is it earthbound, not only is it solar system bound, but it's universe bound. And so this becomes the common denominator of our essence, of our existence. And this has to be acknowledged as the gravitational confirmation. Well, how do we ascertain this gravitational confirmation? So when we get back to our pattern of coiling and we see the spiral growth and the tubing where we have this pattern template being extended, and so the tubular form becomes an artifact of this manifestation. And then we see the cells within the body being the basic structural and functional unit of all forms of life. And then within these cells is a cytoplasm that's enclosed within a membrane, and organelles are inside, each with a specific function. But overall, cells are capable of replication, protein synthesis, and motility. But this energy transfer is all part of a sequencing cycle we call the Krebs cycle that goes through 3 different energy states we call cytochrome A, B, and C. And in that process of going through these states, we create adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP, or the currency of life. And so in biology, roughly 36 ATP are produced from one glucose molecule. And that's what we eat, isn't it? And so in that sequence, there's 12 ATP produced in each cytochrome level. And the combination gives you a healthy cell conditioning of 36 ATP. And what a great bank. You put one glucose molecule in there and you get 36 ATP. Can I take more? Well, we do need to take more if we are in an unhealthy cell conditioning, because the bank B drops down into only producing 2 ATP. So we need to compensate. And in doing that, well, we need to have more glucose molecules. So we need to eat more. And of course, eating more requires more work, doesn't it? And we all like to do more work. So we find that the reason behind this is because of the environment that we created within the cytochrome. And so healthy environment is aerobic, which means it's oxygen loving, and an unhealthy environment is anaerobic, which means it's depleted of oxygen. And of course, this was discovered over, well, 90 years ago by Otto Warburg, and he was discussing the dysfunctionality of mitochondria. And of course, there was a book, The Prime Cause and Prevention of Cancer. And so there was a discussion on fermentation and oxidation of what we call proton transfer, and transferring energy to inside of the mitochondria, which had its own DNA structure. And so the change was from the kind of method of ATP production. And we found that there was a reference to alkalinity and acidity. And so this change of alkalinity and acidity affects what we call the potentiation of bacteria, where it goes from an aerobic alkaline state that supports the host to an acidic state, anaerobic, where it eats the host. So is this a point of containment, a point of conflict, or a point of resolution? So many of us interpret the importance that energy binding has on our self-serving needs. And so they are self-serving and they are needs. Each of us has those. But if we lie, cheat, and steal and take from others, it means that our self-serving needs are satisfied at the expense of others. Well, what satisfies the others? Well, they may just have to steal from others again. And so the cycle continues. And so this becomes what we call the linear pH of war, where, we have the call to arms and then the calls to the coffins. So when we look at the plasma rule, it actually conflicts with that method, because the higher strength in plasma feeds the weaker strength. And so this may become a point of conflict, but it also becomes the binding zone. And it's important to understand, because when we see that a swamp, for instance, and we understand that bacteria are not warriors, but they have this sequencing where one bacteria is a precursor for another. And in 6 weeks, we can create what we call beneficial bacteria. We decide what's beneficial, don't we? And we can convert a stagnant swamp to a clean pond. And so in that science, we discussed that the bacterial supplementation is filterable. But there's a plasmatic supplementation, and we call that non-filterable, and we'll discuss more next week. But it implies a sequence. So we have the gravitational force fields of attraction, which is part of the feedback, and the magnetical force fields of repulsion, which is part of the feeding. And we, as the last man standing, have choices. That is to turn on or turn off the feeding, increase or decrease the strength, enhance or diminish the positioning. All along understanding that the stronger feeds the weaker. And so when we put that on the pH scale, we find that the strong is gravitational and the weak is magnetical. And then there's a susceptibility all in between, isn't there? And each stage is uncut, because an atom is uncut. That's what it means. But an atom and a maggrav basically are the same. And regardless of how small, what you eat is smaller. And if it's too large, then you have to cut it up. But the thing is, you can't cut up an atom, but it can be smaller and it can be larger. And in all case, it's a maggrav. So the question then becomes, if in the y-axis transition dimension, if the physicality of the atomic structure is uncut, then how do we get this splitting? And if we get this splitting, at which pH state does it happen? Why would it be any different? Where's the transmission elemental susceptibility, and how does it jump the gaps? So we see that the splitting is based on a relationship, and that relationship creates a balanced position wherever that is. And that balanced position is the maggrav. So the maggrav is the balance of the magnetical and gravitational force fields. But scientifically speaking, it's a balance between the conservation of magnetic fields versus the conservation of energy. So that's one balanced relationship, and we're going to discuss that in detail today. But there's another relationship we have to keep in mind, and that's a spiritual relationship between the spirit and the soul. And there's a third relationship, the plasma science, which adds to the knowledge. So let's see if we can add to the knowledge. So when we're talking about the conservation of energy, energy can be neither created nor destroyed. It just can be converted from one form of energy to another. And so there's a formula. Isn't that handy? And so when we look at a formula, it has to be in balance where one side of the equation equals the other side of the equation. But there are changes on each side of the equation, which means that a change on one side has to be balanced and therefore reflected on the other side. And so in this formula, we have this initial kinetic energy plus this initial potential energy. So at the beginning, of course, there is no kinetic energy. It's all potential. And then there's this final kinetic energy and this final potential energy, which of course, there is no potential energy at the other extreme. It's all kinetic. And so there are all these positions in between. So if we look at the pH of strength now, we see that there's a susceptibility range between the initial potential energy and the final potential energy, right? That's decreasing. But the initial kinetic energy and its magnetical structure is at its highest level. And the final kinetic energy, well, it's not moving at all. And so it kind of has to cross over in its susceptibility. At any pH state, we can arrive at, but we have to maintain this balance. So this crossover point is movable. And so when we look at our pattern template of our tubing and we see this tubular form artifact, so we have to understand that it's created through this crossover. And there could be a deflection and it facilitates the twisting. So the crossover creates a coiling and the deflection could create a tightening. And then altogether, as it continues, it creates a tunneling. So plasmatically speaking, the balance of one side is a balance between the magnetical gravitational force fields, right? So the initial kinetic energy we said was magnetical and the initial potential energy was gravitational. The gravitational feeding the magnetical, right? And the balance of the left side is equal to the balance on the right side. And the equalness is actually a conservation of the maggrav. And so if that's the case, then when we look at the left side of the equation, we have a relationship between a magnetical gravitational force field balanced off by a magnetical gravitational force field on the right side. And if we have a balance, then that balance has to be between the magnetical and gravitational force field. And so the balance on the one side is magnetical and the balance on the other side is gravitational. And that balance is also mag-grav. So which balance and which mag-grav, and which one are we talking about? And is there more? Well, yeah, because there are these other levels, these other states. So as we move that balance point, which is caused by susceptibility, the susceptibility of movement, wherever it moves, it has to maintain this mag-grav condition, otherwise it wouldn't exist. So that becomes the conservation of susceptibility. So that means that each one of these components in these equations is variable. But although the mag-grav may also be variable, the mag-grav becomes an independent variable. Well, how do we know that? Well, there are 8 billion of us on this planet, and we are all independent variables, right? We have all come together through this attraction and repulsion of field forces, which we call the interaction of the convergence and divergence of energy. And so we become basically the magnetical residue, where we're all independent variables, each one of us. But we are interdependent with the rest of the universe. So we need to be able to reach one. And we go through this emotional transformation. And in that process, we can teach one. That becomes the essence of the one nation, one planet, and one universe. So the conservation of variability has to take into account the variable magnetical and variable gravitational force fields on one side of the equation, and the variable magnetical and variable gravitational force fields on the other side of the equation, which has to maintain a balance between the magnetical on one side and the gravitational on the other side, taking into account the susceptibility of the variability of the independent variable, which maintains its mag-grav position. And so these are the fundamentals of the principal matter, where we see the PM ticks coming together as energy packs. And they create this plasmagen conversion, which includes the convergence of the matter gen, the transition of the dark matter, and of course the principal matter of the antimatter. And in all cases, we create this gravitational condition we call a mag-grav. And so this gravitational manifestation becomes an inertial field of the field of interaction of other fields. And if you're going up or you're going down, it all depends on your point of view, because we're in the transition dimension. And so when we're looking at this transition dimension and how it moves, it involves a plasma shift. And so, yes, with respect to our point of view, the Earth is gravitational, but with respect to our point of view, we are gravitational, right? And with respect to the plasma state, then, being of the higher energy state, it is gravitational. And so when we're talking about energy transfer, we see that the heat and electricity is the lowest energy state. And that is what's pinned us down on the hesitancy highway. But we see that there's nuclear physics and there's plasma physics and dynamic plasma. And then we find that in between there are energy transfer states. And so we can go up and down through these various states. And so our positioning depends on the state. That's why we say we're state dependent. It may sound like a welfare state, but it's not. It's a transcendent state. So we say, okay, well, from the lowest energy state, then we can transcend up. Isn't that, the implication when you say transcendence? It's up. So we transcend from a lower state to a higher state. But that lower state has to be in balance. And then higher state has to be in balance. Well, if we can go from the lowest to the higher, then we can go from the higher to the still higher again. That makes sense. But do we go from the one side of the equation to the other side of the equation in the higher state, or do we go from the lower side of the opposite side of the equation to the opposite side of the higher state? And then from there, go up. Or do we have to understand that there's a balance? Because we're talking about the matter state conversion, and we see that it's a two-way street. So if we have to look at a magnetical gravitational balance on one side of the equation and a magnetical gravitational balance on the other side of the equation, then the transcendence from one state to another state, well, that has to be in balance as well. And so if we go from a lower to a higher, and it's a two-way street, then going from the higher to a higher still also has to be a two-way street. But if we're going from the left side to the right side, it doesn't mean that we can't go from the right side to the left side. And it doesn't mean always to go up. Maybe we're going down. Maybe we're part of the matter state dilution plan. So it's a two-way street. So in essence, this becomes the conservation of the plasmagen state dependency. So not only is it conversion, but it's dilution. And in each decision, it's a maggraph. And so if we go from the higher to the lower, or from the lower to the higher, that becomes the higher being gravitational, the lower being magnetical, but it's a two-way street. And then we see that in the lowest state, well, that's the atomic state. And then we get into the nanostate. Well, that's a higher state, but that's a monatomic state. And then we get into the GAN state, which is a higher state again, but that's a polyatomic state. But that too is a two-way street. So we find that we have a universal body enhancement unit, which is for the purposes of elevation. And we have a material enhancement unit, which is for the purposes of physical manifestation. But one side of the equation is magnetical, the other side is gravitational, right? You can't have a maggrav position without a balance. So there has to be a simultaneous up and downness and a simultaneous crossover. Think about that as the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. So what we are talking about is not just a maggrav condition at the crossover point, but we're looking at a maggrav of the energy transfer state. There has to be a balancing of the transfer state. The transfer state itself has to be a maggrav because the transfer state itself is giving and taking in a two-way street. So this is the matter-gen convergence, where the energy is coming and going. And you have to see that it's not just coming and going like a domino. All of these things are working simultaneously. And we just don't physically have the time and attention to take care of this business in physicality. So we have to enlist the services of higher energy states, which means we also have to account for the susceptibility. It's not just convergence of matter gen, but the susceptibility. Where do we converge? So when we want to look deep into our bodies, we use X-rays. And we have to understand that these create a picture in physicality, which is a manifestation of an image based on density. And so we get to see the bone structure, and we get to see other denser parts of the body, but we don't see the blood. Well, which is kind of important. So when we look at the fetus, we see that the heart materializes before the brain. And this answered a serious question that we had before, is why can't we remember when we were born? I personally don't remember anything before the age of 3, and yet somehow I survived. So when we look at the blood materialization, it too has a convergence and a crossover where it goes through the body, but it goes around the brain. So somehow it has crossed over on its communication path. But since we represent physicality based on density, then we find that things that we don't see, we know are there. And yet we can see cancerous tissue. This is a disruption of stability. And the reason we can see this cancerous tissue is because of its density. So a tumor is more dense as a cancer cell than a healthy cell. And this affects communication. So there's an intracellular gravitational stability, which is facilitated by this unseen communication stability. So from that communication is from cell to cell. It's also from the heart to the cell. It's also from the brain to the cell. And this communication is unseen. But we know that it's there because today, most of us have cell phones, and these cell phones are wireless. Wireless communication is unseen. And yet, interestingly enough, when we talk about the somatoscope, it is not allowed as an instrument of detection in hospitals. And so when we look at the method, how the microscope works, it is based on a matter-gen state convergence. So in other words, there are two light sources, and the relationship between those two light sources are magnetical and gravitational. And so in order to maintain a balance, then that balance becomes a maggrav. And from that point on, there has to be a gravitational magnetical relationship to see the balanced state of the image. And so we see the blood that we can't see with an X-ray. This becomes the matter-state convergence of the somatids, which are magnetical because they're very tiny bodies. And we see the gravitational blood cells, which are the large bodies. And anyone who has used this microscope, and this picture only shows 30,000 magnification. The more sophisticated ones are over 125,000 times magnification. We can see the creation of the somatids from the blood cells. But there's no door on the blood cell. And the blood cell seems to be a ring. And can't see what's inside the ring. So we obviously need higher magnification still. So now we understand the limitations of the matter-plasma dimension. We're so focused on the physical, which is part of the feedback, but we have to understand that the matter state is also plasmatic. This part we can't touch or see. And we say, well, that's part of the feeding cycle. But the manifestation of the matter-gen state is part of the feedback, whether it's physical or plasmatic, because there has to be a balance. So as knowledge seekers, that's the balance that we're seeking, right? You don't know something, then seek the knowledge to balance it off. And so we see the red blood cells and their existence and the purpose. They serve the cells and they target specific cells. Since we have over 73 trillion cells, we have a lot of red blood cells as servers. So they become form constructors. Some are in acidic condition, which is alkaline forming, and the alkaline condition is acid forming. And the white blood cells, well, they're also targeting specific conditions. White blood cells come in contact with every cell. Red blood cells don't. And not every cell is healthy. Some are unhealthy. So when we're looking at the potentiation of balance, we see that there's a crossover from the acidic to the alkaline state, and understanding that one side is magnetical and one side is gravitational, but it isn't just the maggrav condition of the acidic state or the alkaline state, but the susceptibility created from that balance. And then the condition and the form could be acidic or alkaline. And this is an ongoing process. So when we look at the z-axis, we see it's a spherical field that is a combination of the x-axis polarity and the y-axis polarity. All of these fields are rotating. And there is no garbage field. So when we have to understand what causes attraction and what causes repulsion, we have to ask ourselves, when you see the pH of the locust swarms, what is causing their attraction? And why is it that when we apply the plasma water to our crops, that the pests leave? And it's all based on oxygen, isn't it? Because our health is also based on the same principle as the plant health, the aerobic condition, oxygen loving. And we see that the oxygen spectrum is, again, a unique color. And that color is a signature. And it also is a gravitational conformation. So now we have a gravitational conformation of hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. And so when we look at the feedback summary, we see that, we have a lot of satisfaction with a fine meal. We get feedback from sound, light, heat, pressure, luster, superficiality, and the laminar containment of each of those individual fields. And so it facilitates the combination of the x-axis transmission dimension and the y-axis transition dimension and the crossover thereof. So it facilitates the dominance of our man-made range deviation. But, there are no microbes in outer space because they're already quarantined. They're quarantined here. And they affect us. And we affect how they work. So we are also quarantined in this Earth space spherical z-axis transition form artifact. And we call that life. But that life is a conditional life on our Earth space, because that life constitutes all of the elements that you see on the periodic table of elements. And all of these elements are created from the interaction of these force fields, the balances of the conservation of the laws of energy. And of course, one of those things that we all want is gold. But it's just another element on the periodic table of elements. So when we're looking at the transmission spectrum, we have to see that it's part of the transition of the visible transmission spectrum. That's why we can see this spectrum. So it reflects a spectrum to spectrum susceptibility, doesn't it? One is hydrogen, one is oxygen. And what we're seeing is really the surface superficiality versus the internal substance. You say the substance, we can tell what it is based on its physicality, but do we see the plasma substrate? That point of containment is only within the visible spectrum. And on one side, it's gravitational, on the other side is magnetical. And then there's one step beyond. And this is all part of the transmission spectrum. And did we say in which dimension? So when we look at the z-axis transmission dimension, we see that it has to involve communication. And our antenna has always to stay within the range transition so that the energy can be released. And that binding energy precedes the retrieval of the beneficial energy. And the field release precedes the field capture, and the giving precedes the taking. The emission precedes the absorption. Motion cannot exist without coexistence because motion is a product of existence. So the motion and coexistence reside in both matter states. And so there's a crossing over where the plasma dominant tuning precedes the physical dominant tuning, but the range transition is based on nearness and proximity of the X and Y axis interaction. And so the interaction could be from one side of the equation to the other side of the equation, but it can also be from the other side of the equation to a higher energy state. And it always has to be in balance, right? So is not man space centric or earth space or sun space centric, but it is dimension centric. And when we say the dimension, we have to look at the proximity and the nature of the pressure in that dimension. And we have to understand that there's 3 transmission dimensions, and none of them are the message. So the question is, how is the message contained? And then which transmission dimension is a manifestation of the folding deviation? So when we talk about digestion, it's not just of the food, it's the energy and the waste. So the digestion is a matter state transition. And so when we look at the state dependency, we see that there are various states. And whether it's a physical state or a universal state, in terms of Magrav balancing, they're all uncut, regardless of what the susceptibility is, regardless of what the pH is. So within a state, there's a state dependency, and in between states, there is a state dependency. And it's all based on the new atomic mass, which takes into consideration the neutron mass equals the proton mass plus the electron mass. But we also have to add the mass of the PM takes and the total mass of the matter, antimatter, and dark matter. But we have to understand mass better, because there's a totality math, and that is achieved through energy level balancing and positioning. And that is not mass dependent, it is on state dependency. So when we're targeting outer space, we have to understand that we're in this gravitational Earth space, and we need to transmute to this gravitational some other space. So when we target our point of view, we have to look at the reality dimension. The balance between the MAGRAV field of the gravitational magnetical balance and the MAGRAV field of the balance between the materialization and dematerialization. That's how we target outer space. And we have to set up an antenna to get this message, which is really a feeding and feedback manifestation combination. It's part of the transmission tuning transition. So when you select one force and it is magnetical, it is balanced by a force selection of another gravitational force. So the resulting selections feed the MAGRAV manifestation. And this is a selection. And this manifestation is predetermined by choosing the peace dome of intention. So the range transition affects the standard folding deviation and leaves no room for war. The Z-axis transition balances to and from the peace dome. So when we look at the plasma balance, yes, knowledge and wisdom can give you deeper insight, and experience will change a man's perspective. It allows us to reflect on life, and we need to reflect on that. Misconduct becomes harder to rationalize, and historical references become meaningless. So the pH balance seeking becomes a polar balance, and the plasma balance is uncut in any state. So the state dependency likewise is uncut. The state transcendence, therefore, is also uncut because of the needs to have a plasmatic balance. So that's the pH of the MAGRAV. There are many points on that perspective scale. So, we look at the linear North Pole and we see the curvature of the planet, but, there are two poles. So when we look at the linear manifestation of electric motors, we have to understand that there are other dimensions to take into account, that they interact as well, because they have created our blue planet. And the reason it's a blue planet is because it is neutral on the pH scale. It's us who, through bloodletting, is turning the planet red. That's why the pH of peace has many points, and we are part of that. We need to manifest that. And so we are now in the second month of the 2024 transmutation test. Please join us. Enjoy the experience. And also be part of the research teams. There's more to learn. We're just skimming the surface. We're just now learning that we can make new process, new selections, new choices. We're in the post-March 15th era, March 15th of 2024, where we understand our Earth space is really a bountiful space, and our inner space is a very graceful space. This graceful space allows us to enter the transmutation space. That's where the greater oneness comes in, which we've been teaching for 550 knowledge seekers workshops in a row, allowing us to transcend the limitations of nuclear science and broaden our horizons. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We welcome all the beautiful knowledge seekers. Learning about this new selection process of the new plasma science, it involves world peace. There's a world peace treaty. You need to sign it with a pen, with your soul, with your heart, with true intention. We'll say what causes the transition of the Z-axis dimension, and is the man the reactor of a three-dimensional universe? Can man find heaven through the field transition? Can man go into outer space without a peace dome? Microbes cannot. They can't transition dimensions of history. So the transition of state dependency manifests the physical transmission dimensions. So understand that. Understand the balancing principles, because plasma science needs to be delivered daily via the peace dome in exchange for peace on Earth. And that's the fundamental equation of balance. Welcome to the new outer space age. That's the end of this class. Thank you so much for listening.
And thank you so much for delivering, Alex. I think these teachings will probably open up more to us as we understand more as we go into the future. But let's see if any of the participants would like to raise a point or ask a question about what you just covered or take an exception to what you said. There's no problem either way. The imbalance of fields starts the creation process. So any of the participants would like to make a comment, feel free. Again, nobody's right, or nobody's wrong, and nobody's 100% right. It's the way you look at it and the way you understand it. While they're contemplating whether to come in or not, could I take the screen for a moment?
By all means, Mark.
Okay, let's see if we can share. Okay, and then we'll just take this screen here. And going back to this new channel that we have, gosh, I hope I have it here. Here we go. We go into the inner sanctums of the neutrons, protons, and electrons, and we find only magnetic fields, their interaction, and what is created from these interactions. This was one of the opening videos on the new channel. Of course, we thank the Brazilian team and continue the elevation of their soul and the soul of their team to, as Mr. Keshe said, the soul has the strength to see it through, but we continue to elevate them. But here they're saying, so there's no physical atom, it's just a plasma of energies. There's no physical electron, it's a plasma of energies. Is this the way? I always thought the atom was something that had been isolated and it's there, they can see it with very powerful energies, or did they just look at the energies and said, this is the atom, even though it's all magnetic fields? Same with the proton and same with the electron, or well, the proton electron is the atom. But I'm saying there's no matter state here. We see the magnetic fields, their interaction. Would you like to comment on that? I know we've heard before the electron doesn't really exist or the neutron doesn't really exist. Does it really exist? It exists, but not so much in the matter state. Is this our understanding?
So again, two questions.
Darn.
The matter state has two parts to it: the physical state and the plasmatic state. they're both part of the matter state. So the atom, of course, does exist, but we can't see it. It's in the plasmatic state. What we can see is a form artifact of the atom. And so from there, we've made some conclusions. It is safe to say that most of us aren't scientists. So, when someone makes a discussion, say, oh, well, this is what an atom looks like, we just assume that they've seen it. I was one of those people. So now we know that they've never seen it. So what have they seen? They've seen the artifacts of what happens. And then on that basis, they try and explain it. So we all become like a detective. So we say, well, I've come to the scene of the crime, and I see the body, and I see the bullet, and I see the blood, but I can't find the gun. So a good detective would, come to the conclusion and say, well, I can't see the gun, but I know there's a gun involved. Well, the detective could be fooled. Someone could have staged the form artifact, if you will, of the crime scene. But, through repeated processes and experiments, the truth comes out. And the way you prove a theory is to disprove a theory, and you only have to disprove it once. And so a lot of these theories are easy to disprove, such as, Einstein's equation, and, our understanding of, well, neutrons, protons, and electrons, because by applying the knowledge that we have from these science, we have to arrive at certain conclusions. And when we find that those conclusions don't balance out, when the equation doesn't balance out, then is our conclusion wrong? Or is the premise of the components of the equation wrong? Because something is wrong. So both of those things could be wrong. So either or both. But if we have the correct conclusion and then apply that and come up with a correct outcome, then I'd say that we know what we're talking about. And this is why the plasma science has been moving ahead on the hesitancy highway, because it's correct. It has never been proven wrong. Only our understanding of it has been proven wrong. So when people say, well, it doesn't work, okay, well, it doesn't work according to conventional theories. Well, that's a strong foundation, isn't it? When these conventional theories don't work either. So you don't want to be building your house on that kind of shaky ground. But when we have the plasma science foundation of the MAGRAV positioning, then we have to understand that there's a balance of these field forces. And is this balance only within the physical state? And did you know that there were other states? So in the nearness of these states, the small m matter state and the capital M matter state, they're part of the matter state. Yes, they are. But the atom did not come from the universe. The atom is a form artifact of the interaction of these fields. So that's the basis of this picture that you've put up. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, and you can take the screen back if you'd like to. That probably would be appropriate. And as the American Indian said, it only takes one white crow to prove that all crows are not black. And interestingly enough, I happened to see a picture. I don't know if it was photoshopped or not, but I always thought all cardinals were red. And they had a picture on the internet. I don't know where it was. I think it was on the East Coast here somewhere. And they showed a yellow cardinal. I think they said it's very rare, but it changed my understanding where you see the exact shape of the cardinal, but it's not red. It had a yellow orange color to it. So again, it only takes one yellow cardinal to prove that all cardinals are not red. And this is what's happening in science. Anyone else want to come in with a question or a statement or an exception? You mentioned Einstein, Alex, and so many scientists always refer to, well, Einstein said this or Einstein said that. So when they go to do something, the other scientists may say, well, no, Einstein said that's an impossibility. And since they put Einstein up on a pedestal, is Mr. Kesh trying to softly, in a way, open the books of this understanding of this very famous scientist? They've all looked to Einstein, or did Einstein purposely, in a way, mix it up? Or did he not quite understand what he was doing in so many ways, and he sort of had to fudge a few things, and because the others didn't understand it, they just accepted it? Again, two questions.
Yes, but Mark, I've been teaching at the foundation for over 6 years, and I have said this all the time. So, you know, this is something that I've known all along. That has not been something that Mr. Kesh has told me. And in fact, I knew that before I joined the foundation. I knew it 30 years ago. And the clue, of course, was the fact that he worked as a clerk at the patent office. You know, this is a tried and true method of gaining knowledge, stealing it from others.
Mm.
Okay, so he's never done any research other than reading the various patents and having, shall we say, preferred position in reading these patents. So I was shocked to hear that, to tell you the truth. I thought he was a scientist. I didn't know that he was
I
just.
always did too. I mean, this is widely accepted that this is the premier understanding of energy and so many other things in physics, I would imagine. And then, of course, we see pictures of him, or they say he worked with Tesla on certain projects and other people on certain projects and consulted on this and consulted on
Yeah,
that. So, yeah.
well, just a moment now. Okay, like let's discuss that particular subject. And I've discussed this before in the private teachings, but after World War II, England and Germany agreed that censorship would not be allowed. This was a law. And compared to what's going on today, so that's I'm not going to make any comments on that, but I always believe that we had the same condition in Canada.
That censorship was not going to be allowed. Okay.
Yeah, it's actually a law. It wasn't to be allowed, but in Canada or North America anyway, censorship is not allowed, but it's not a law. It was a law in England and Germany. So because they found that the censorship was a direct cause of the world wars. So eliminate that from happening again, well, those laws were actually brought in. And you know, when you contrast what's going on in the world situation now, so we understand that there's a problem there. But I grew up, you know, believing in the system in Canada, and my health deteriorated very rapidly into a very desperate state when I was 35 years old. I was given 6 months to live by the medical community, so I rest my case on that point. So when I learned about the new methods, I was told I had to learn about life, and I said, I don't want to learn about life. I just want to get rid of cancer. I mean, that was what I was every day of my life for 8 years, was the topic of cancer. And I wanted to get rid of that, and I just wanted to know how to deal with that. And so, well, in order to deal with that, you have to understand about life. And I thought, well, wait a second, you know, that's a big leap, you know, to go from, you know, something which I thought was, you know, a small health issue, to, you don't tell me about, you know, life. I wasn't really ready for that challenge, but I needed to be ready for that challenge. And so, like, why not? You know, when am I going to get ready for that? You know, as I didn't do it as a child. I didn't do it as a teenager. Obviously, in my youth, I was, you know, too busy doing other stuff. So, you know, well, maybe I'll do that when I retire. You know, I'll learn about life when I retire. Well, at the age of 35, when I was given 6 months to live, I didn't think I was going to live till retire. So maybe it was a good time to learn. So at the age of 40, I started to learn, and I started to devour books. Well, I couldn't. There were too many books. I just didn't have enough time in my life to read all the books, so I had to discriminate. As unfashionable as discrimination is, I had to discriminate. So let's focus on Einstein and Tesla. There, let's discriminate that way. So, you know, let's select the elite scientists, if you will. Okay. So I look at the biography in the library. Actually, it wasn't in a library, it was in a bookstore. And I found the biography of Einstein. Oh, this is so great. And I thought, well, what else is in this section? And oh, I found the biography of Tesla. Oh my God. What are the chances of finding these two in the bookstore at the same time? So I just thumbed through the book, and I found a picture. I found a picture of Einstein and Steinbeck, and the background was washed out. And I found a picture in Tesla's book. Would you believe it was the same picture? It was Einstein and Steinbeck, and Tesla was in the middle, standing behind them in that washed out background. What are the chances of that happening? And within those few minutes, I went through a lot of emotions. Everything from, oh, eureka, look at the discovery I made, to sheer outrage. And it wasn't just the outrage that they would go to the extent that they would actually cut Tesla out of the picture. Okay. But that was a form of censorship. And at that point in time, I realized that it didn't break any laws, because there weren't any laws on censorship. We just allowed it. And that really actually really changed my outlook with respect to Canada. And I was really deeply disappointed because I had the utmost faith in this wonderful country. Well, I still have the faith in this wonderful country. And I have the utmost faith in the rest of the North American population as well. In fact, I was disgusted with humanity at the time, but now I am very, very upbeat about humanity because I'm part of humanity and I was deceived. And I went through a great, great effort to try and uncover this truth. And it was really just a sheer luck that I was there at the right time to see these two books side by side. And how many other people had that opportunity. So at that point in time, if you were nominated as the scientist of the century and you cut out Tesla, who had over 1,200 patents, and how many patents did Einstein have?
I don't know.
And how long does it take to write a patent? 1,200 patents. And the second leading number of patents at that time was around 600. And it was by a known plagiarist. And he did the same thing that Dirk did to Mr. Cash.
But you would think having Tesla in your picture would give you quite a bit of credibility. I don't think Tesla hung around with any average scientist in so many ways. And then you're saying they brushed him out of the picture.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I was shocked. And I'll tell you, this is it's a wonder that, with all the knowledge that Tesla had and why he was still stuck in AC and now as Mr. Cash has put forward, well, the resentment that he must have felt from, the conflict that he had, he would not recognize DC. And that was a shortcoming. So we see how our own, prejudices, limit us. And we have to be able to transcend that. So the question came up. I was looking at a seminar where someone was, talking about plasma water, for instance, and how they spent thousands of, or actually millions of dollars on the research, but they didn't call it plasma water, but it had all the same characteristics. And I thought to myself, wow, we've all made plasma water for about $10 in our homes. What a tragedy that he's wasted so much money. But the thing is, he is part of the effort to try and advance science, and that was the way he knew. So rather than criticizing him and saying, oh, you wasted a lot of time and effort and a lot of money, and you're making all these claims, what we have to understand is that he is part of the solution process. And so now that we see other ways and means, better ways, there's no reason to discriminate or put him down. because in the process of doing what he's doing, he's not a mass murderer. And this is the part that, when you're looking at the peace dome, we have to differentiate between the warmongers and the peacemongers. And so, when you're looking at Otto Warburg, for instance, and he's a member of the Warburg family, and who were part of the warmongering family, and yet he was a peacemonger, and of course he earned 2 Nobel Peace Prizes. Like a good dog, he received a little treat. But he kept on doing that, and it was fortunate for him that he had the wherewithal to continue his research. But the conclusion was that cancer cannot live in an alkaline state, and that goes back to the 1930s. And if I'd have known that, when I was sick, then I would have not had that problem. What I would have had a problem with is understanding what constitutes alkalinity and what constitutes alkaline forming. And so I wouldn't have understood the crossover principle, although we do understand that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So that crossover we understand, but do we understand the relationship of the plasma dominant field, how it supports the physically dominant field? And do we understand that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength? And do we understand that that is the direction of flow? So if we understand that basic rule, then the question then becomes is how can the magnetical feed the gravitational if the magnetical is weaker? Well, it all depends on the state, doesn't it? So the higher state feeds the lower state. So we have to understand that the magnetical in the higher state will feed the gravitational in the lower state, and the gravitational in the lower state will feed the magnetical in the lower state or the still lower state. And how many states are there? And so you look at the layers in an onion, or better still, look at the number of circles in a tree trunk, and you see the number of rotations. It's amazing. So it's more than 3. So we find that each dimension is a construct of multiple states. And so we look at that video that you were referring to, and it shows the 129 Tesla. It's not a 129 Einstein, is it? Back to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Anyone else want to come in here, or would you allow me to keep Alex all to myself here and asking questions? Anyone else want to bring up a topic, a question, or something like that? You mentioned GANs, and you said we make the water GANs. Now, what are you referring to there? Are you referring to GANs water or plasma water? Because you said we made the water GANs. Is that what you're referring to? Plasma water? GANs water?
Yes, plasma
Okay.
water. Yes, but the plasma water is in a physical state, you understand. But the plasma water has an affinity to the GANs, and the GANs is in the physical state. So the affinity is not in a physical state. The affinity is in the plasmatic state. It's non-tangible. But because of its nearness and proximity to the physical state, it's part of the matter state. So this matter state, which manifests our physicality, and when we have an X-ray, we can't see the water within us. And that water is not just clear, but it's just not visible. And it's because of that we can't see the field strength of it. We can't see the state that it's in. But we can certainly feel the state that it's in. And one of the big clues that we had earlier on was the fact that GANS is a lie detector. And then we found from the Japanese studies that, water is a lie detector as well, or at least it's an emotion detector. And that makes sense because we're very emotional. But did you know that there's a physical emotion and there's a plasma emotion? And so the physical emotion, sometimes we call that love. But is love a physical thing? Or is the enjoyment of the love a physical thing? And is the enjoyment a physical thing? So we can apply the same principles to money. So the money itself is not the problem. It's the love of money that's the problem. The money has many benefits. It's just like a car. A car has many benefits. But sometimes lives are lost with cars. So it's not the car, it's the person who uses the car and the way the car is being used. A car has damaged people, but a car is legal. A somatoscope has never hurt anybody, and yet hospitals refuse to use it. When you get to the bottom of that question, then you understand where the problem lies. So if we understand that the Tesla 129 achievement was back in 2014, that was 10 years ago. Why have we been riding on this hesitancy highway for 10 years? If you had a marriage and you said to your wife that I'm going to work, and you come back with no money, and your wife would question you.
And lipstick on your collar.
Yeah, well, I'll go to work tomorrow again and try again. Well, I wasn't successful today. Well, do that for 10 years and let's see how long the marriage lasts. But the tribesmen in what we call the Aborigines, or the so-called primitive tribes in Africa, when the wife is at home taking care of the house and the man goes hunting, and we like to go hunting between 9 and 5 days a week. But when the tribesman goes out hunting and he looks at the sunshade on his sundial and he says, oh, it's 4:30, I better get back home, because I only work from 9 to 5. Well, you don't want to go home and say, well, sorry, honey, I didn't achieve any success in my hunting. Wouldn't she say, well, then why did you come home? Don't come home empty-handed. So the hunting continues, and the hunter will continue to hunt. But what is the reason for the hunting? The reason is to provide for his family. And so that is the natural way. And so you hunt because that's what you know. What happens when you know better? Do you still continue the old way?
Perhaps. I know Mr. Kesh said, was it the last Knowledge Seekers workshop where a hunter will take over his position in the Kesh Foundation? And he went on to describe that hunter a little bit. John, thank you, Alex. Unless you had more to
Yeah.
say, John has decided to step in. Hello, John, again.
Hello. Fine,
Hi, Joe.
fine. Hello, Alex. I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about that scope and the limit of magnification. I understand there's a limit of magnification you can use in a microscope. You're not allowed to use a higher magnification factor.
I
Is
wasn't
that
aware.
true?
No, I wasn't aware of that. I think the limitation is the fact that it's a microscope. So, you know, it's not a nanoscope.
Yeah, I saw that picture, yeah. But, well, what is it? Why are you calling it nanoscope if you got a microscope up top? Because it works on reflections or something.
Yeah, it's a convergence of the magnetical gravitational force fields.
Yeah.
The microscope is the same as your eyes.
So in
You
other
know,
words, they only wanted you to peer so far into the creation process.
exactly.
Yeah. And your eyes just passing information. The convergence is in your brain with the nerves.
Well, if I may just clarify, now I understand the sensitivity and the nerves are also two different states. So the sensitivity would be in the plasmatic state, and the nerves would be in the physical state. And so the physical state goes up and down, whereas the plasmatic state crosses over.
So again, even though these mechanisms to see very, very high resolution and magnification is tightly controlled, I think you've been over this a couple times, Alex. Yeah, they are made, but they are not even to, I think you've categorized it as illegal for people to actually possess some of these tools.
Yeah, there has been a slackening off of the legality. So I think many people, what they're using is a dark field microscope or something like that, and it has 8,000 times magnification, which is still considerably higher than the 1,200 times magnification of a microscope. But you know, the most important factor of the somatoscope is that it's looking at a live blood analysis versus a stain. So that's the difference between a picture and a movie, right? You can get a lot of information from a movie, a lot more than you can from a picture, right? It enhances the context.
So again, do you think these research centers will start to crack open in a way through some testing and some results of some of these myths that we've believed, and it'll be actually documented to open up the scientific community to a deeper understanding or a more correct understanding, if we could put it that way?
Well, you have to identify which scientific community. So that is already you know, out there. It has been discussed you know, many years. Like I say, you know, when you look at Antoine Béchamp, that goes to 1851. So you know, it's been around for a long time. But you know, if you understand the nature of the medical business, then you have to go back to, you know, 1198 or even beyond that. But the the question is the limitations on the science, and the limitations aren't on the scientific side. The limitations are in the practical application of the scientific side. So it's not the money that's the problem, it's the love of money that's the problem.
I thought you were going to say the problem's on the political side. But no.
Yeah, well, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it?
Okay. Anyone else?
They're
Yes,
side by
please
side.
continue. Yes.
Politicians and capitalists working side by side. So
Well, I could never understand, when I was in school, one of the things I learned early, and I'm saying, like maybe grade 3, I learned about Christopher Columbus. Why would someone, maybe 8 years old, learn about Christopher Columbus? Like, what do I care? 1492. But anyway, before my time. But the thing is, he didn't discover America, and that's what I was taught. He was just discovered America. What he discovered was the people who discovered America. So, that was a blatant lie right off the get-go. But, I didn't understand the nuances of English, okay? So you say, well, he discovered America. And then I think, well, based on the way he was greeted, and, even Mr. Kesh alluded to this, if you go to a new land, you'd go there pretty quickly, relatively speaking, but it might take you a long time to come back. And why wouldn't it? And then, in hindsight, if I were Christopher Columbus in that position, I know what a horrible trip it must have been, because he believed that he would, find India. But, I think he was the only one on the crew. Unfortunately, he was the captain, so she was able to keep going. And then, lo and behold, he finds India. And, but it was West India. But anyway, it was paradise. Why would he come back? What an idiot. What an idiot. Seriously. You see paradise and then you say, I'm not sure. I think I'm going to go back to where I came from.
Or did his bosses that were financing the trip
I was
force him
going to
to come
say,
back?
yeah, he had to bring the loot back if there was any.
And when you're talking about the microscopes, I think there's only 1 or 2 companies that make all the lenses. So there's another monopoly. So when we had a Zeiss microscope and we literally wore a gear out to send it back to Germany, it was cheaper to go buy a new one than to send it back and wait 6 months for them to fix it. And that was a dark field microscope too, for doing live and dried blood. And you're right about a movie and a picture. And this is why I even wonder if Gaston Nissan's wife still has the microscope.
Oh, yes, she does.
Oh, she does?
Yep.
Well, thank you, Randy. As I said, I'm going to play the one of the other short videos at the end there, and somebody told me it was you, Randy, that was narrating it, but apparently that was not you. But it has a similar, in a way, sounding voice. Very nice.
Maybe it was my other self.
Your plasmatic self, huh? Anyone else want to bring a question, make a comment, or bring an understanding to us? Thank you, Alex. Thank you, John, and thank you, Randy.
Well, thank you all for allowing me to continue making these presentations. And as you can see, next week is going to be the concluding episode of the Advanced Transition series. So thanks all for hanging in, and I look forward to seeing you then.
So when you were talking about the color of the GANs changing, and you said that's because the pH changes, I thought it was because it's absorbing different energies, and maybe that's also a reflection of the change of the pH. But I thought it was the energies that were changing the color in a way.
Okay, so that's three questions
Oh,
in one
gosh, I'm
question.
getting worse.
Yeah, what causes the energy change? And you know, I wish I had the scale here of the different colors. So the changing of the colors is dependent on the frequency and the wavelength. And so the higher frequency has the higher energy. So if you're imparting higher energy, then you're in the blue shift. If you're drawing energy, then you're in the red shift.
But they all result in a change of the pH.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And the pH is a state. And so when you go from one state to another state, there has to be a balancing. So we only see the pH state as being in the physical state. What I'm saying today, and I'm that's part of the teaching the way I understand it, or the way I explain it, is that a transition from state to state also has to be in a balanced state. Which is to say, you can have the pH in the one physical state and the offsetting pH in the plasmatic state. And that would balance off the equation.
Right, very similar to what he said. You know, we talk about the amino acids, Mr. Cohen, but he said the amino acids of the soul is totally different. Anything you want to address there?
Well, certainly, if we look at the carbon dioxide, you know, I was brought up to understand that, you know, I breathe in oxygen and I exhale carbon dioxide, which means that the oxygen is in my lungs. Excuse me.
Right. Only about 17,000 times a day if you're at rest. Or
Yeah. So the oxygen is in the lungs, but so is the carbon dioxide. And since we understand that the carbon dioxide will deplete or will extinguish a fire, but it will also you won't survive if you're in a carbon dioxide rich environment. That's why the carbon dioxide in our environment is only 0.04%. So it's like teeny tiny, incredibly tiny. But what I'm saying is, if we have carbon dioxide in our lungs, then how can we breathe? Because it should be highly concentrated in our lungs, isn't it? And so we expel that. So during the process of expelling, then obviously we're not breathing in. So maybe that's how we do it, and that's how we've always understood it. But then we understand that we can take the carbon dioxide and extinguish a fire, and all the creatures, including humans who might be in a forest during a fire, and if we encircle that fire with plasma carbon dioxide, the fire will be extinguished, but the life will carry on. So how is it possible for carbon dioxide to extinguish a fire? And in one case, asphyxiate all living creatures, and the other case, promote the life of all the creatures.
Yeah, that is an interesting anomaly in a way when you see people out in the woods and they're, let's say they're there and they want to start a fire, so they gather the driest amount of material in a small amount, and then they strike the starter and it makes a spark and it lands in that little pile of material, and they blow on it to get it to get that ember, that coal to start to catch to the others, and you would think it would put it out in a way. But since
That's another point, isn't that's a very good point.
yeah, because we're releasing plasmatic CO2, as I understand it, from the lungs.
And then,
So
of course, if you throw water on the fire, if you don't throw enough water, then the water will evaporate, and of course, the fire will get stronger.
yeah, just another one of those little anomalies where they gently blow on this little bit of hay or dried twigs to try to get it started. You think it would put it out, but it actually increases it.
That's why life is for learning, you see. So,
Yes. Mhm.
you know, we really have no excuse. But right now, you know, even the discussion was on the Tucker Carlson network this week, you know, about what would happen, you know, if we had a national catastrophe. Uh, you know, many of the rural Americans are prepared, you know, for wood burning, which, you know, is really strange for an advanced nation to even contemplate. But more importantly, is the deer population would shall we say, evaporate probably within a week, because obviously our food supply system would also break down at the same time. So, you know, where a lot of people think that, oh, you know, well, if I can't go to the supermarket, I'll just go hunting. Yeah, well, you know, you and your neighbors all have the same idea. So it's going to be total chaos. And everything that we're talking about in that particular example has to deal with physicality. And nothing there is dealing with the creation of life. So, you know, it's great to be able to, shall we say, live off the grid and, live the way our grandparents lived and, you know, live off the land and all of this thing. But we've never answered the question, you know, where does the universe, how was the universe created and where do we come from? And, you know, and for that matter, where are we going? We just kind of, ignore it and say, well, we'll just put that off, and one day, you know, maybe if we're fortunate, we'll find out. Well, you know, that day could be the split second before you die, and then and we see that in many cases, you know, and the people make a decision at that point in time. Yeah, yes, come and get me, and I'm leaving, or wait a second, you know, I'm not really as ready as I thought I'd be, because we keep looking at things from the physical side, from the physical matter state, and we have to understand that it's beyond the matter state. It's like it's beyond the plasmatic matter state. How far beyond? Many layers beyond, and it involves the soul, and it involves the soul of physicality. And the soul of physicality are not in the matter state. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you as well, Alex. And Roald was saying, you know, you just unpack the physicality when you arrive in the transmutation. But didn't Mr. Kesh say he was in some of these meetings that when they were planning the assassination of the Iranian president, and he gave such specific details of what transpired in that meeting and when they carried it out and so forth. So obviously he couldn't be there in the physicality, but he was able probably to see. He was probably able to hear, obviously, because he gave them such specific details, and maybe smell as well, but there was no physicality manifested. I'm still struggling with this a little bit. whether we would manifest a physicality in the transmutation or need to.
No, Mark, we don't need to. So this goes back to something solid that I was taught, and that is the purpose of going to sleep. So on the one hand, you know, we need to recover from our physical exhaustion, and so stop consuming and recharge the batteries, if you will. But the soul doesn't need that. So what is the soul doing? The soul is preparing us for the next day. And in order to prepare you for the next day, it also has to prepare those who interact with you. And so therefore, every part of humanity is going through this process. So when they sleep, so you may not communicate physically, but your soul is communicating plasmatically. And the soul is the prime mover. The soul is the higher gravitational state, and it feeds the weaker physical magnetical state, right? So everybody knows. Everybody can interchange with that. It's just a matter of where your focus is.